Hey, it's Dr. Crone again. So one of our takeaways from the last video was that a lot of Americans think there are problems with the US system of education. So in this video, we're going to look at some efforts to address those problems and to reform education. So let's take a look at some of the ways states have tried to reform education. All of these reforms are designed to improve performance and education outcomes. Some of them are very controversial, and almost all of them cost money and require tough policy decisions by state legislatures and bureaucracies. So these are not things that can be suggested lightly, and legislatures really have to wrestle with a lot of these. So one of those types of reform is school choice. We'll spend a lot of time later in this video talking about school choice. Reforming teaching, trying to improve teaching, is another thing that states have implemented. School funding, which we talked about in our last video for this unit, is something that has been addressed in some states in terms of making funding more equal or improving or increasing school funding. Some that we're not going to talk about any more than just on this slide are one thing that's really hot educational reform right now is to reform early childhood education, to make preschool required and paid for by public money in the states. I know New York City has just started requiring 4-year-old preschool before kindergarten and paying for that, making that a public education option. Things like that are getting a big emphasis in a lot of states these days. Career and college readiness. So you're involved in something that states have gone to, College Credit Plus, things like that, beefing up career education, trying to tie in with businesses in the state and things like that. Those are all areas that have experienced a lot of change recently. Changes in college affordability and access. So College Credit Plus really provides that as well. Certainly is giving you guys an affordable option for college. Lots of different states have experimented with different reforms, some even making college free in certain circumstances or for some students. And we know that that is being pushed by one of our Democratic candidates for president this spring. So that's something else that can be talked about, free college. And then increases in standards and holding students responsible or holding schools responsible for student performance. I think a lot of you are real familiar with those kind of reforms and changes that have happened. And that is an ongoing thing that continues to be changed and modified. So these are all areas where states are wrestling these days and coming up with new and interesting and, like I said, sometimes very controversial policy ideas. So let's look first at the reforms that have been used to improve teacher performance. So it turns out that states have a lot of ability to influence teacher performance, at least teacher preparation, because they're responsible for teacher licensing. So if they change the requirements for training and licensure, they can change the level of preparation that teachers have. So in some states have required more education than they used to. Some states, including Ohio, require a master's degree to stay as a teacher after a certain number of years in the profession. A big area that states compete with each other is in trying to recruit the best teachers in the country. So offering higher salaries and higher benefits, better working conditions is a way that states, if they have the money to do so, can compete with other states, especially neighboring states. Teacher salaries has been a very controversial issue these days. There have been some mass teacher strikes, statewide teacher strikes, where teachers have walked off the job asking for the legislature to increase funding for the schools, not only for their salaries, but also for support staff. I know in Ohio, the teachers unions have been really pushing for more counselors and just more teachers so that there are smaller classrooms and things like that. Some states have, including Ohio, have used standardized tests to rate teacher performance and to have teacher promotions and things like that go by how well the teachers have done, at least according to the standardized test performance of their students. There's lots of different ideas about the most fair way to sort of measure, is a teacher good or not? I think you've all experienced really excellent teachers, and you probably also experienced not so good teachers. And we know what we're talking about when we say that's a bad teacher. But it's hard to pin down how would we measure that. So sometimes people say measure student improvement from beginning to end of year, or measure a portfolio of student work. Some people say administrators, like principals, should be mostly in charge of deciding which teachers get promotions and higher salaries and things like that. All of those have good and bad sides to them, so those are all issues that get talked about in this process. So I'm going to spend a lot of time, most of this video we're going to spend talking about school choice. So school choice has been around since sort of the late 1990s into today. And school choice is your book calls it a market-based approach to education improvement. And what it really means is that market-based means that it's based on the ideas of capitalism and the free market. And if you look at it from the perspective of people who argue for this, public schools are seen as a monopoly because in most situations, students and parents don't have a choice what school to attend or not. And the idea here is based on the idea of capitalism, that monopolies are inefficient, and they don't improve their performance because they don't have to, since they have a guaranteed customer base. In this model, we think of parents as customers. So the idea behind this is if you give parents and students alternatives to public schools, then the public schools will improve because they'll have to either compete or go out of business. Now, not everybody agrees with this model, with seeing education in this way. A lot of people say education isn't a marketplace, but there are a lot of innovations that have come out of this framework of choice that really was the product of the Republican Party and conservatives in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So there's really 4 different types of school choice options, and we're going to look at each of them in order. So magnet schools, charter schools, vouchers, and homeschooling. And all of those represent innovations in school policy making that give parents an alternative to the normal public school trajectory for their children. So first of all, magnet schools. Magnet schools have actually been around for much longer than any of these other innovations. And actually, the school you attend, the ILC, is a kind of a magnet school. So a magnet school is run by the school district itself. It is not an alternative to a school district. It's an alternative school within a school district. So it's a public school within a district offering specialized instruction, just like the ILC does, programs that the students can't get at their home buildings. And the reason it's called a magnet is because it attracts students from all over the school district, just like the College Jumpstart program attracts students from all 3 of the Hilliard high schools. This is often a strategy used by districts that worry about whether high-performing students or families will leave their school district and go somewhere else, will move and take their participation with them to another school district if they don't have good options for their students, if their kids are bored or their kids are not getting the kind of specialized instruction that the parents think would be best for their student. So you guys already participate in this. Magnet schools have been around since the 1960s. They're often used by large urban districts. In fact, that's sort of where they started. And Columbus Schools has a ton of magnet schools like this for all different kinds of learning. So another and much more controversial kind of school choice is a charter school. So charter schools are not run by school districts, but rather they are independent schools that are established by some kind of a group, usually a group of teachers, sometimes a group of parents or a community group. And its purpose is to compete with the public schools, but it is publicly funded. In other words, all the money comes from state tax dollars. So there's no cost to the student or parents, but it's an alternative to the public school. This is a very big, this was the biggest push of sort of the school choice market-based reform idea, was that these charter schools could be organized and run in areas where parents were dissatisfied with their own school district. And their kids could go there for free. The state would pay the money that would normally go to their school district to pay for that student would instead be given to the charter school to run the education for that student. And in the last 20 years, they have just multiplied, just exponentially. Ohio has a ton of charter schools. So the thing about charter schools is they've been around for 20, maybe a little over 20 years, but they started out being controversial and they've become even more controversial. One reason is that there's been a lot of problems with them. There's problems with student performance, with teaching, with the educational quality, with financial mismanagement. And a lot of the problems have come from groups of for-profit companies, essentially, that run these schools and are trying to actually make a profit. In other words, they're trying to make their cost of delivering education lower than the amount of money that the schools get from the state, so that that profit can be given to their shareholders. So in other words, they say they can make education cheaper and then make a profit. And a lot of those, not all charter schools are run by for-profit organizations. A lot of them are run by nonprofits, but the for-profit organizations that run them often run up against quite a lot of the problems we were talking about. So in Ohio, there's been big problems, particularly in 2016, 2017. And the state legislature is attempting to address a lot of those right now, has addressed some of them. You can look at the chart on the right here and see that charter schools have not lived up to the promise that they would provide better education for their students. They're doing worse than most of Ohio's public schools in terms of student performance. There's also been a lot of corruption found in some, not all, but some of the Ohio charter school companies. You can see there's been tampering with tests. There was a famous case in Dayton where they were hiring people to come in and erase answers on students' test scores and write incorrect answers. They've cheated on attendance. There have been a couple charter schools in Ohio that basically didn't have a way to keep any kind of accountability for student attendance, and they were just reporting that they had 100% attendance every day when they did not. There have even been schools that were basically a total sham and just designed to steal money. So if you want a really critical look and more information of that, John Oliver's Charter Schools YouTube video, you can find on YouTube, just Google John Oliver Charter Schools. It's a 20-minute clip. There's some in the middle. It starts at about minute 9 or so, talking about Ohio. It's all really good. Of course, it's very one-sided, but it's good. And if you want to, I'll give you 5 points extra credit this week if you watch that video and comment on the part about Ohio somewhere in your discussion board post. So that'll just get you 5 extra points on the discussion board post if you would like to do that. So not all charters perform badly, though. Some of them are excellent. Some of them are very ethical, and they are beneficial, and their students do well, especially in urban poor communities. So I'm not knocking all charters for sure. But even when charters do well, there are some good arguments against charters. One of the arguments is that what happens with charters is they take the best students and the most involved families, students who have families who would normally be really supporting public schools and supporting their students in public schools. And what they do is they siphon them out of poorly performing schools. And that sort of leaves the public schools with the most difficult to educate children. If you think about it, it's really the parents who are consumers of education, but the students are the ones who are actually getting the education. In order for a child to decide they want to go to a charter school, they have to have their parents know how to navigate the bureaucracy to get them into the charter school. And it's not like a student in third grade can just say, hey, my school's not good, I'm going to go to another one. So that's where the consumer metaphor breaks down a little bit, because if a student has a disadvantaged life where their family either can't or won't be involved in their education, then that student's kind of stuck in a poor school and in a poorly performing school. And there's going to be more and more of those kind of students who don't have family support. Plus, charters do not have to take students with disabilities, students with behavioral issues, students with mental health problems. They can expel students all they want. So they basically get to keep the students that are easier to educate, and those other students are left in the public schools. And that has kind of created a downward spiral for some of, especially urban, poorly funded urban schools. And of course, the state money for the students goes to the charters rather than to the public schools. So there are definitely arguments against them, even when you're not talking about, sort of unethical, illegal behavior. So another kind of school choice program is the voucher program. And a voucher program is different because a voucher program gives state money to private schools. These are not ordinary charter schools. These are private schools like Catholic schools or Christian schools usually, where students can get their tuition subsidized, essentially covered by the state. Usually these are poor students and or students who are living in a poorly performing school district. So in a failing school district. Often these are sort of last-ditch alternatives when there's a failing school district. The idea here is that we don't have time to reform this school district. It's in such bad shape, it needs so much, and meanwhile there are suffering students here who need an alternative. And so let's have the state pay for them to go to already existing private schools that other kids attend by getting their, by having their parents pay tuition. And the idea here is that, well, if you live in a poorly performing school and your parents are middle or upper class, they have the money to pay for you to go to a Catholic school or a Christian school or some other sort of private school, whereas you're a poor student would not have that much. These are controversial for a lot of the same reasons as charters are, only more. Part of the biggest argument against voucher programs is that most of the private schools are religious. And so those who don't like charters or don't like voucher programs say, hey, this is state money going to benefit a religion, which is against the Constitution, at least in that argument, according to that argument. The US Supreme Court has actually said this does not violate the separation of church and state, but there are still people who argue that it isn't good for religious organizations to be benefiting from tax dollars. Just like charters, they do siphon the better students with more committed parents, because again, to get these quote unquote scholarships, they're scholarships, but they're really not based on merit or anything like that. They're based on you go to a failing school, so you qualify for one of these scholarships, but there are a limited amount of them. And parents who are more committed and involved are able to figure out the bureaucracy again and figure out how to get their kid the voucher scholarship when other students may have parents who either can't or won't be involved like that. So, and again, opponents are saying, hey, why don't we spend that money on improving public schools rather than giving it to religious private schools? In Ohio, we have a school voucher program. It gives vouchers to students in certain categories. So the first are those, just like I said on the last slide, those identified in failing school districts or school buildings. If your school building is assigned an F grade in its indicators on the school report card, you are eligible for those vouchers. But recently, Ohio has added any K through 3 student in any district who's living in poverty can also get eligible for that. And that's intended to go up as time goes on. So eventually all students living in poverty will be eligible for vouchers for private school, regardless of what district they live in. And then vouchers are also used for special ed students who want to go to a specialized private school. For example, there's one in Columbus that specializes in educating kids with dyslexia, and it's a private school, but if you qualify that you have that dyslexia in Ohio, you can qualify for a voucher to go to that school. Vouchers are super controversial these days. They're very hot topics right now because in the last few years, states have pushed, or some wings of the Republican Party have pushed in some states to have vouchers available to any student, regardless of their need. Just basically to say, if you want to go to a private school, the state should pay for you to go to a private school. This is often backed by religious conservatives because these tend to benefit religious schools. And the idea is the more kids, from a religious perspective, the more kids going to a religious school, the stronger that religion will be. Betsy DeVos, that's a picture of her here. She is a major advocate of all students having access to vouchers. And the Trump administration also backs that. Now, of course, they don't have the ability to make a state law about that, but they certainly have pushed in states and offered their support to states that are considering that. I think Arizona was the most recent state to pass a law like that. So the last one of our alternatives is really different. It's homeschooling. And of course, homeschooling is not a state-run program. It's a personal choice. And about 3.5% almost of students in 2018 attended homeschools, were homeschooled. And that number has jumped quite a bit, doubled, in fact, more than doubled since 1999. It's mostly white students. About 70% of all homeschooled students are white, and non-poor students. So these are mostly white middle-class students who attend homeschools. Now, the reason it's a state issue at all is because state governments because education is required in the state and attending school is required in the state governments have had to pass laws that allow homeschooling and then that place some regulations around the practice. And those vary wildly from one state to another. But in general, the government usually has some level of involvement in being sure that students are learning according to a state plan of what they should cover. They've had to deal with issues like college admissions. Are homeschooled students going to be admitted to public colleges? And if so, how? Are we going to know how they did in school? And then there have been some issues about are homeschooled students, eligible for extracurricular activities like sports or music activities or things like that. So all of those are things that the state governments are involved in deciding what's legal and allowed and what isn't. So in that way, homeschooling is an alternative, although it's very different than the other choices we've looked at. All right, so that's the end of education reform video lecture. And now that you've watched both videos this week, you are ready to post in our weekly discussion board. And remember, there's extra credit. So if you don't remember what that was, go back in this video and find out what that is. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.